Hi there, welcome to Tuesday's Indycar. This is Gordon Ross here. Today's subjects are the European Union and its comments recently concerning the progress of the Brexit talks, and also a Scottish currency. How are we placed at the moment? What's the situation and the feeling and the work that's been done so far on the Scottish currency for an independent Scotland? Let's take the European Union first. Michel Barnier has said this week that he believes that it is possible for the UK and the EU to strike a deal within 6 to 8 weeks. His more sort of conciliatory tone is at a bit of a departure in terms of the way he says things. But effectively what he's telling us today is a little bit like saying there will be presents on Christmas Day. I mean, you know it's going to happen, we still don't know what it will be. But the point is, he claims at least that the European Union feel that it's possible to reach a deal with the UK before the deadline of November, which is when the 27 states of the European Union will meet to discuss the British, what's known as the divorce deal. It's the terms on which we leave, not the trade deal afterwards, but the way the UK departs from the European Union, how that is done, and also how people are treated afterwards, and how migration and other aspects of international affairs are conducted. Now, if Barnier is being a bit more conciliatory, it's really just to do Theresa May a favour and to offer a last straw of hope to the British government that they can reach some kind of deal. But the question is, what kind of deal is it going to be? And the answer to that is, well, it's not changing. The European Union, although it's offering a more conciliatory tone in these negotiations, is not moving on its fundamental rules, and those are the ones which constantly pull Britain back from having a deal. And those are the red lines, the so-called red lines about control of our borders, about the unrestricted migration of European workers in and out of the UK. But remember that the UK has always been able to stop migrants from crossing into our territory. Anyone from outside the European Union, for example, even someone who has migrated from North Africa through Europe to try and get into the UK, would still be stopped under current legislation in the UK, because that person is not an EU citizen. Unless that person has been accepted by the European Union as an EU national, they cannot cross the British border into Britain anyway. And so this talk about migration being a big scare is not the big deal that we're led to believe. And Britain actually controls somewhere in the region of 70% of migration already, and that's for everybody from outside of the European Union. However, to get back to the point, it looks as though that the Europeans will just still give us the same deal. It's not going to be a great deal. It can't be a great deal. It will be watered down, and the EU might even drop the conditions about the Irish backstop just to try and facilitate some kind of deal. Now, if they do that, which is possible, it's unlikely, but let's say they did, for talking's sake, they dropped that precondition and said, look, we'll set that aside for now, we'll talk about it later. This is the deal we want to give you, and Dominic Raab brings this deal back to the UK. Is the Commons likely to accept it and vote on it and say, yes, this is what we recommend for the country? I don't think so, and most other people don't think so either, because it is still going to put the UK in the role of taking rules from the EU, because whatever we do, the leaving of Europe is not up to the UK. The leaving of Europe is up to the EU's rules and regulations, and those are actually written, believe it or not, by a British diplomat, and those rules tell us how we have to exit. So there's not going to be much movement in the actual deal itself. And whether this is going to be accepted by the Commons, whether the Labour Party and the rest of the Tories will vote it through and will accept it and allow Brexit to take place on these rather poor terms, I don't know. But it's the most likely scenario, because everything else is worse than that. No deal is unthinkable. No Brexit deal, in other words, no terms with Europe for just leaving, not trading, just leaving the EU, would create chaos at every port. and every airport, every point of entry in the UK would instantly shut and foreigners would be thrown out, basically. This is how it would work. Foreign customs posts would simply be shut down, dismantled, and their staff kicked out. It would be nasty. It would be like the Berlin Wall just being built suddenly in a day around the United Kingdom. It's not a nice thought to have. So the situation really hasn't changed very much. It's all a question of what happens in 8 weeks' time. So by November, we'll be able to see what's been offered, what the UK can get, and then we'll be able to look at that in some kind of reasoned way and decide whether this is going to be a good deal for the UK, and if the United Kingdom Parliament will accept it and recommend it to the people. It could provoke rioting, it could provoke all kinds of things. We just don't know, and we won't know, unfortunately, until towards the end of October. And there's many things could go wrong between now and then. In the second part of the show today, I wanted to talk a bit more about currency. Now, if you look back to 2014, you might remember that there was a survey done. It was actually Lord Ashcroft, Tory peer, who launched this so-called independent survey to look at people's reasons for voting yes and no, why they did, why they didn't vote for independence. The biggest single reason out of all of them wasn't Europe, it wasn't jobs or the economy, it was the currency, it was the pound, or the lack of a currency union. And this was the one single stroke that the UK played in the whole of the independence referendum. It was the biggest trick that they played to confuse the electorate into thinking that they wouldn't be able to use their own cash, their own pounds anymore after we left the UK. Now this was a falsehood, it was a lie. What they basically said was, we will not give you a currency union, you will not be able to use the Bank of England as your bank of last resort. That was all it was. They didn't say you can't use pounds at all. But the way they worded it was, you can't use British pounds. If you walk away from the UK, you walk away from United Kingdom pounds. Now that was a lie, we know that, but the point is, that was what swayed 50% of the no voters to vote no. Now if you take that out of the equation, and 50% of the no voters who said that was their reason for voting no would then vote yes, that is a huge swing towards independence. So to satisfy the people who were scared off by the currency issue, we need to address that urgently. We're still no further forward. There's no information from anybody on what currency Scotland would use after we leave the UK. There's been talk of us using the pound, called sterlingisation, in other words, adopting the currency of another country. And in our case, adopting the pound is not adopting the currency of another country, it's adopting the currency we currently use. And sterlingisation would mean we'd just continue to use British pounds. It's just we wouldn't have the Bank of England pulling the strings. However, despite the fact that we wouldn't have the Bank of England as a bank of last resort, the Bank of England would decide things like interest rates if we use the British pound after we leave the UK. It might be that we have to accept that for a couple of years, a few months, whatever, until we organise our own currency. In order for a Scottish pound to work, the Scottish Government needs to have a reserve. Now that means a bank full of foreign currency, other people's money, basically. In order to get that money, the Scottish Government needs to sell Scottish bonds. Now Scottish bonds, or government bonds, are guaranteed investments. So a foreign investor, let's say they want to invest £100 billion in Scotland. Well, they invest that money into Scotland's investment bank initially. Okay, now that puts foreign currency into that investment bank, £100 billion. So there's a bank full of cash. That currency will make a certain percentage every year guaranteed for whoever's invested it. Now it's guaranteed, so it's a fantastic investment for anybody. Now, when Scotland becomes independent, the first thing that an investor will look at is, what does this country have as its natural resources? It's got tons of them, right? It's got decades, maybe centuries more of oil, of gas, of coal. It's got decades, centuries of tidal and wind energy absolutely spilling over with energy sources, not to mention its food and its other exports. So Scotland's a brilliant place to invest in. And as soon as Scotland votes yes, the first thing that would happen is investors will start to buy or want to buy Scottish bonds. So the new Scottish Government needs to act quickly. Firstly with a constitution, a written constitution which founds the new state, and with some kind of documentation, some legal instrument which then begins the process of issuing bonds. And it would need to do that through its own investment bank initially, and then eventually through a treasury which would be set up in due course. Now, what happens to the currency after that depends on how much investment goes in, and the value of the currency will rise as the investment floods in. The point is, do we tie our currency to the value of something else while this is happening? Do we tie it to the pound, for example? I don't think we should, because after Brexit and independence, the value of the pound will nosedive, and it's likely to keep diving for quite a while during all the turmoil that will happen with Brexit. So it's perhaps not a good idea for us to peg our currency to the UK pound. So our Scottish pound might be better off linked in some way to perhaps the euro and one or two other currencies, let's say a basket of 6 internationally tradable currencies, so that it finds its own value on the international markets and is not connected with the UK pound. Very important that it's not, because if it is, it goes down with the pound, and that would cause problems for us. Remember, England is not a big market for Scottish goods. The European Union is a far larger market than the UK in terms of goods that we sell. So England is not the primary market. The internal market of the UK is not our biggest export market. Our biggest export market, incidentally, is America. After that, it's Europe and the rest of the world. So England does not feature very highly on it, so we don't worry about it too much. So which currency do we use? We use the Scottish pound. We can call it what we like, but basically it's the Scottish pound. Commonweal has already come up with a plan for currency, and they believe that the new currency can be up and running within about 3 years, and I would agree with them. The Scottish Government is taking the most pessimistic view possible by referring to its Growth Commission report, which basically looks at Scotland's economy as though we were still running it from London. In other words, if Scotland was continuing to be mismanaged the way that London does it, this is how our economy would look. They're campaigning on they're planning on the basis in the SNP government that Scotland will come out of the UK with a large deficit of, let's say it was £15 billion, something like that, which is a share of England's debt burden, basically. And it's a share also of the deficit, the lack of money to pay that debt back. Now, if you accepted that for one moment, and I don't think we should, but let's say we accepted that we would repay our part of the English debt, which they took out supposedly on our behalf. Could we do that? Well, yes, of course we could, because our oil revenues would all come to us. They wouldn't be shared out amongst the rest of the UK. We would get the whole lot. And that whole lot would cover the entire deficit within 12 months. And that's well known, because we know what the tax take from the North Sea is, because it's published. And it's been published in the GERS figures, and it's been published in the UK's figures and facts from the Office for National Statistics. So the point is that the currency would be the Scottish pound. I don't believe it should be linked to the English pound at all. It should be allowed to find its own value, maybe in relation to 6 or 7 other tradable currencies linked to their value and floating around that level. I believe that after independence, as long as the Scottish Government moves fast enough to issue bonds, that the Scottish Investment Bank will fill up and form the function of a treasury initially, so that we can issue more bonds and bring in more foreign currency. And as we do that, the Scottish pound will soar in value as more and more people invest into the country. More and more people want to buy into Scotland. They're not actually buying anything in particular, they're just putting money into Scotland as investment funding generally, and they will get a certain percentage of that back each year, which is guaranteed. So it's beholden on us to grow the economy as soon as that currency comes in. But the point is, we don't need to spend 10 years setting up a currency as the Growth Commission report suggests, because the Growth Commission report is based on the mismanagement techniques of the British government, not the way Scotland would be run in its own right. So all I'd like to do to summarise this today is just to point out to you that, first of all, in terms of Europe, the British government is about to get probably quite a poor deal from the EU, but we knew that was coming anyway. But it will probably come, and there will be some compromises, but it's not going to look great. The second thing is that we need a Scottish currency from day one almost of independence. As soon as we voted yes, we need to open the bank. We need to say, welcome to Scotland. The bonds are ready for you to buy. You can buy in as many billions as you like. This is the bank account number. That money comes pouring in right after the yes vote. It strengthens Scotland's economic future substantially before we negotiate with the UK even. So I think this must be in place before. If the Scottish Government is smart, it's already setting up the financial mechanisms for this to happen. But waiting 10 years for a Scottish currency would be stupidity. To go down with the pound for 10 years would be an absolutely daft idea. Why do that when you know your own currency is going to soar as soon as you sell those bonds? It makes no sense to go with the British pound initially. It might be for a month or two while you're waiting for your bonds to sell, but after that, no, you don't need to do that. I would rather initially tie the value of the Scottish pound to the euro, at least for a few months, because the euro is likely to be more stable and the pound is likely to plummet. Either way, Commonweal has, I think, the right of it here. The Scottish Government may be flying a kite to see what would happen if they put out this really bleak view of what independent Scotland would be like, because the really bleak view demonstrates that it can still be done even with the worst possible British style of management you can imagine for the whole of Scotland. You can still be independent. But if you manage the economy correctly, then you don't have to do that at all. And I don't think we're going to do that. I believe the SNP is just proving a point with the Growth Commission report. They're saying if Britain was running Scotland, Scotland was independent and the Tories were running it, this is how they would do it. And this is why there would be austerity for 10 years. But at the other end of it, Scotland would still be independent and would still survive, even under the Tory mismanagement that it has now. But the SNP must have another plan up their sleeve, because the growth report is the most pessimistic worst case scenario there could possibly be for independence. And there's no way, I think, that anybody would base Scottish independence upon that methodology. So, to clear things up, to keep things simple, Scotland will sell bonds. And Scotland will sell bonds after it's independent, and that will basically raise the value of the Scottish pound far beyond anything the British pound could ever hope to reach, because the British economy is sinking and the British government is isolating itself from the rest of the world, closing its doors, putting up the shutters, filling the moat, pulling up the drawbridge and saying keep out, in much the same way the Americans are doing. But Britain, unfortunately, is too small. It doesn't have the internal economic might that America has with its 50 states. Britain is just one state. It's not even 100th the size of the American economy, and yet they think they can manage this feat without trading links to Europe. I think it's madness. So anyway, I've rambled on long enough, but currency for Scotland needs to be Scottish pound. It would be done in about 3 years, and it would be done by selling bonds. British government is going to get a very lukewarm deal from the EU, which may not be accepted and might cause further chaos. And those are my opinions, and those are the two news items I wanted to cover today. I'll see you later. Bye for now.